Shalom Aleichem. Good afternoon and welcome to the virtual Miles Nadal JCC. My name is Lisa Roy. I'm the manager of Adult Daytime Culture and Education at the Miles Nadal Jewish Community Center located in downtown Toronto. It is my pleasure to see so many familiar faces and a special welcome to anyone who is joining us for the first time. I know that many of you are in Montreal and we have friends who are joining us from JCCs across North America. It is a privilege to be hosting today's program, the Rare Books Collection of the Jewish Public Library. This event is presented in partnership with the Montreal Jewish Public Library, known affectionately as the JPL, and is generously co-sponsored by the Dr. Michael D. Paul Rare Books Initiative. We greatly appreciate you keeping yourselves muted, but I do encourage you, please turn your cameras on, open your chat bubbles if you're able. For those of you who regularly attend our JCC programs, unlike our regular lectures, when we request that you hold questions until the end, today's presentation is designed to be interactive. So I really encourage you, as you receive prompts from the JPL staff, not to be shy and to participate. If you experience any technical difficulties during today's presentation, please type a private chat to my JCC colleague, Anne McElraith, or to myself, and we will do our best to help you. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce today's primary guest speaker. Eddie Paul is the Senior Director of Library and Learning Services at the Jewish Public Library. He oversees collections development, reference services, and education outreach. Eddie developed the Dr. Michael D. Paul Rare Books Initiative in 2014 to mark the JPL's centennial year. This is a project that combines research and storytelling. These workshops have been given both in person and virtually in elementary and secondary schools, universities, synagogues, churches, seniors' residences, and community centers. And we are delighted to welcome Eddie Paul, along with Nicole Baudry and members of the Special Collections staff of the JPL, to our JCC this afternoon.
Well, thank you, Lisa. Thank you to all of your colleagues, and thank you especially to the Miles Nadal Jewish Community Center, Toronto, for allowing us to invade your space this afternoon. Before I introduce my colleagues and give you a little bit of background and context for this initiative, what we would like to do is just put our land acknowledgement up on the screen, which is something that we've been getting in the habit of doing for the last year or so. This is something that is fairly typical of most institutions and organizations, particularly in the government, but we have just started doing this over the last year or so. So Isel is just going to put up our land acknowledgement. The Jewish Public Library is situated on the traditional territory of the Kanyen Kahaka people. This land was also a meeting place for many indigenous nations. This land has been the site of exchange, creativity, and storytelling for thousands of years. We are grateful to be able to cultivate lifelong learning, imagination, dialogue, and creativity here. Thank you. I would like to just introduce the people who have made this possible this afternoon, and indeed for the better part of the last 9 years that we've been doing this. The way that we usually do this is folk festival style, so I will give a little bit of introduction. Nicole will be sharing the first book, I'll be doing the next one, and so on and so forth. So I'll start by introducing Nicole. It's Nicole really who gave this workshop initiative its current shape and form when she joined the Jewish Public Library 6 years ago. Now, Nicole is currently an instruction and academic support librarian in Vancouver, but she worked here for 6 years as a reference librarian the interim director of the archives and of the Norman Berman Children's Library. She came onto this project because she has a particular interest in the provenance and printing histories of the books in our rare book collection. And her particular interest is sort of in this context is in the historic and often unexamined roles of women in the history of the Jewish printing trade. So welcome, Nicole. Nicole and I have been doing this for quite some time together. I'd also like to introduce my two colleagues who joined the JPL last year, Isel Carter and Ellen Belshaw. Isel is our digitization outreach librarian, and it's Isel's slides that you're going to be seeing up on the screen this afternoon. Isel has worked at the Simone de Beauvoir Institute of Concordia, Rare Books and Special Collections at McGill. She's worked in libraries in Minneapolis, Minnesota. She has also done work in Turkey, I believe. And her particular specialty is archiving and knowledge management. Ellen joined us a few years after Isel did. Ellen also holds a master's degree in information studies from McGill. Her background is in art history and photography, and she works as a curatorial research assistant in Mexico. I believe it was a couple of years ago. And this past summer. Ellen is responsible for a lot of the research, administrative, and public relations support that make these programs possible. Now, just by way of introduction, we were talking a little bit before we actually started this session. I'd like a show of hands, even though some of your cameras are probably turned off. How many of you are Montreal expats? Raise your hand. Lots of you. I'm making this, I actually can't see you, but I'm going to assume that a good number of you who are not from Montreal had some roots here or who lived here, who basically, the reason I'm asking that is that some of you, I'm assuming, know what the Montreal's Jewish Public Library is about. But for those of you who don't, I don't want to take up too much time because we have 500 years to get through in 90 minutes. And I'd be very happy to answer questions about the library and its collections, perhaps after the session is over. I know that for about 50 or 60 years, you had a Toronto Jewish Public Library. It was the Albert and Tammy Lentner Jewish Public Library, but in some ways it was similar to what we are, but in many other ways it was quite a bit different. What I will say for now is, at the risk of hyperbole, Montreal was often referred to as the Vilna of North America, in the same way that Vilna was often referred to as the Jerusalem of Lithuania. Montreal's status as the locus of Jewish intellectual life in Canada was recognized around the world. And the JPL was one of the more important centers of this idea as the site of cultural exchange between writers, dramatists, artists, and journalists whose lives and work became integral to an understanding of Jewish life in Canada. But as I said, we'll talk a little bit, maybe if we have time, we'll talk a little bit more about other kinds of things that the library does near the very end, because we really want to start this 500-year travelogue right away. This
that's what I'm using, isn't it?
This Rare Book initiative really is about telling stories. And I'm going to start off with one. There is a midrash to Exodus 32:19, which, as some of you might recall, is the moment at which Moses is descending from Sinai and sees the Israelites dancing around the golden calf. And for those of you who remember your Exodus, Biado luchot ketuvim mishnei avrehem mizeh umazeh chem ketuvim. The tablets were written on both their sides, and the tablets were God's making, and the writing was God's writing engraved upon the tablets. And it was when he neared the camp and saw the calf and the dancing that Moshe's anger flared up. He threw the tablets from his hands and smashed them beneath the mountain. Now, this midrash, echoed in the Talmud, has a slightly different version of what happened, in which Moses was depicted as basically just a prop in the scene. When he caught sight of the Israelites dancing around the golden calf, the letters on the tablets flew off. Consequently, the tablets became much too heavy for him to keep aloft, and he dropped them. Now, how could this be? The Talmud reminds us that the Hebrew letters were not simply engraved on the tablets, but were in effect drilled right through the stone. Many Hebrew letters, as you know, are circular. The rabbis, of course, attribute the fact that the letters remained in place without the stone crumbling. They attributed this to a miracle. One rabbi, however, concluded that the tablets were not holding up the letters were holding up the tablets. In the presence of turning away from God, the letters flew back to their primordial source, and Moses could no longer carry them. Now, why did this story stay with me, and why is it relevant in this workshop? For one thing, it allows us to imagine that Jewish texts, irrespective of whether they are holy or secular, have a life beyond our mediation with them. And second, the fact that the story has stayed with me for this long suggests that stories are a highly effective way of teaching and learning. We could have just as easily inflicted our research on you, our 10-page bibliography, but I really think that it's far more engaging for us to tell you the stories about these books and the printing, which will hopefully stay with you beyond these 90 minutes. Now, rare book research, and this is where the two figures on your screen will become relevant in a moment. Rare book research largely involves establishing the provenance of very old books, all the places books have traveled and exchanged hands throughout their lives. Provenance is the record of custodial ownership of historical objects. And in the case of books, this can mean signatures, notes written in books, marginalia, book plates, and stamps. Now, this is important because it allows us to learn more about how people have interacted with books, as well as the influence that books have had on social, intellectual, and written history. And it also allows us an insight into the lives and interests of people throughout history. But here's the problem. We have about 15 to 1,800 books in the Rare Book collection. 100 to 200 of them were collected by one of the JPL's co-founders, the person on the left, Yehuda Kaufman. Now, Kaufman was a polymath, a polyglot. He had a classical yeshiva education, but he also studied at the Sorbonne. He studied in London. He studied at McGill. He studied at Dropsy College in Philadelphia. He studied philology, grammar, anthropology, English literature, history, political economy, sociology, and German literature. He was invited to Montreal by our other founder, Ruben Brynon, stage right, who was a journalist, essayist, and as someone who traveled here from the US to become the editor of Canada's biweekly Yiddish newspaper. Ironic, perhaps, because as the JPL's first director, and we'll find out about this a little bit later, he didn't hold Yiddish in particularly high esteem. He was a Hebraist, and he saw Hebrew as the future of the Jewish people. He was also a committed Zionist who alternately lobbied for a homeland either in Palestine or Azerbaijan, depending on which audience he was talking to at the time. Brynon was a fascinating figure, extremely conflicted, ambivalent, and we'll learn a little bit more about him at the end of this session. They began the first, that was the infancy of the Jewish Public Library's Rare Book collection. But the bulk of the collection came in the early 50s as a consequence of the Offenbach Archival Depot. The Offenbach Archival Depot was the central depot in West Germany, not far from Frankfurt, in which all of the books and artifacts that the Nazis had plundered during the Holocaust, this is where they were gathered. And it was the hope that most of them could be repatriated to their original locations. And in some cases, that was possible. There were some libraries where they had their entire collections returned to them. In other cases where the institutions no longer existed, the books had no place to go. So a group of scholars, and this was just after the State of Israel was created, a group of scholars, notably people like Hannah Arendt, spearheaded an initiative to distribute these books to libraries all over the world. And this is exactly what happened. Now, the Hebrew Library in Jerusalem received most of them, but others were distributed to Oxford, the New York Public Library, other universities throughout the United States. But in Canada, the Jewish Public Library was the largest beneficiary of this collection. And it was at that point we got about 1,500 books. This was an arrangement brokered by the Canadian Jewish Congress at the time. We got some more donations a little bit later on. The widow of an entrepreneur, Hyman Ressler, who ran the Canadian Buttons Factory, gave us a number of volumes as well. And we've had a few donations here and there over the course of time, but that really is all we can tell you for the most part about the provenance of this collection. And that's the sad part. Much of our research over the past few years has been in trying to find out where some of these books have come from. A lot of it is detective work. A lot of it is trying to make some educated guesses. And in some cases, I think we've done a good job. In other cases, we just don't have the adequate information. But that gives you a background of the collection as a whole. The book we're going to start off with is the oldest book in the collection. And that is the book that Nicole is going to start off with right now.
Thank you so much, Eddie. So the oldest book in the collection is the 1481 printing of the Antiquities of the Jews by Josephus, Flavius Josephus. I'm sure this name is familiar to many of you. He is a very controversial figure. He is considered to be the nearest proof of the existence of Jesus of Nazareth due to an inclusion in the Antiquities known as the Testimonium Flavinium, in which he references Jesus of Nazareth. Whether or not this is a actual testimony written by Josephus or something interpolated by later translators remains a highly contested point of debate, but it does explain why so many other writers of Josephus's time did not carry forward into the future, while Josephus's manuscripts, well, not in manuscript for original manuscript form, but later copies of them still remain available to us today, and why his writing was so replicated. The printing of the JPL's copy is our only incunabulum. Incunabulum are books printed within the first 50 years of the invention of the printing press. And as such, it's a particularly fantastic edition. It really highlights the transition between hand written manuscripts and later printed works with a layout similar to what you might find on your shelf today. It retains, as you can see in the picture behind the information, extremely wide margins with significant space for annotation, as in this copy here, or illumination, which other copies do have. This is another sort of holdover from the manuscript era. Books at this time would still have been printed in reasonably small runs, and they would have been bound and illuminated at the behest of the purchaser, not the printer. So whoever purchased our copy of the 1481 Josephus did not have it illuminated, nor even completed. There are pages, such as the very first, where you can see blank space at the beginning of a paragraph in which a small printer's note has been included demonstrating which letter should be illuminated in its place, as you can see right here. The printer, De Novo Maggio, was a from the Netherlands, and for some reason, what that would make him, the word exactly escapes my mind, but he came to Italy in order to establish himself as a printer. He married a woman, Donna di Palla, who had married not one, but two previous printers, I believe, and both of whom had been German printers who had also set themselves up in Venice. In fact, her first husband was Venice's first printer, having brought the technology from Germany into Venice. She was very wealthy, and it's quite clear from the output and quality of output that De Novo Maggio was not maybe impassioned by a job as a printer, and perhaps this was a bit more at the urging of his quite savvy wife to have married not one, not two, but three people in a burgeoning new industry. She passes away in 1480, so shortly before this book is printed. By 1483, he basically has ceased printing entirely. However, what does appear to be his true passion is creating type. De Novo Maggio worked with two different typefaces predominantly, but there is research that demonstrates that up to 16 could be attributed to him, particularly music type. That was what he was quite interested in. However, he was, by most accounts, very bad at it. This was not, despite his passion, there was very little talent to accompany it. Many of the small letters, in fact, many of the type in this book, for example, are quite hard to read, and it's very easy to misread one letter for another because they're poorly typed. So for example, there is a letter which you might read as a lowercase b, which is in fact indicating it should be an H, but because of the poor cut of the type, the lower arm of the H connects with the staff, so it looks like a B. What's interesting about our copy in particular is that it appears to have been used very heavily for actual reading and study versus as a collector's item, essentially. Many books at this time would have been, would still have been very, very expensive despite the printing press. So many of them were used less significantly than this particular copy. When I was still able to access it, I counted no fewer than 3 individual hands who were performing heavy annotation that does extend throughout the entirety of the volume, which is pretty unique. The other thing about it that's quite interesting is we can see types of annotation that demonstrate a more scholarly approach, perhaps. We see the frequent I think they're called manus in actual vocabulary, but little hands that are pointing, which is very precious and cute, and a very typical way of highlighting something you would find interesting at this point in time. Our particular volume does not have its original binding. It has been rebound and was likely rebound during the Victorian period, probably in the later half of the 1800s. The reason for this is twofold. So one, the marbled paper is obviously not from the 1480s. This would be very popular during the Victorian period. The Victorian period is also, post-1850, is also when we switched from cloth paper to pulp. And it is extremely acidic, it is not stable, it falls apart very easily, which is why the binding is now in 4 pieces, the book is now in 4 pieces, the front, the back, the spine, and then the block of text, the block of pages itself. The interesting part is that the pages from 1481 are in significantly better shape than the binding. Based on the so it is a half binding, so you've got the quartered corners and then the strip along the edge. It is likely that the original binding was repurposed in order to create the half binding and then add the marbled pages on the front and back. The other compelling part about this is that the foredge contains the information about the book. I think if you are a bibliophile, if you're somebody who's interested in older books, you've probably seen foredge painting before, where beautiful images are painted on the foredge of a book. And then if you move them, you see more of the picture, things like that. In the 1480s, and before that, books would have been stored horizontally and with the foredge facing out versus the way that we now store books, which is vertically and with the spine facing out. This is where bibliographic information would have been read. So as you can see here, the word Josephus is written across the foredge. There's no other bibliographic information. One of the reasons for that is that this is a complete, this is an opera of his works. So all of his work is in this volume here. The other reason is because very likely whatever library originally had this book, whether it be a monastery or something more academic, it very likely was not owned by an individual at any point due to the lack of illumination. They probably only had one volume written by Josephus, so there wouldn't have been any reason for further bibliographic information. We can contrast this to the spine added in the 1800s, where there is full bibliographic information visible, including bibliographic information you would expect to see today. So here you can see the author, we can see the title, and further down, I believe we can see the printing information. So this is much more familiar to a modern audience. The book itself came into the Jewish Public Library's collection through donation. So this is not one of the Offenbach repatriated books. There is very little information on the donation itself, unfortunately, or how it came to be in the hands of the person who donated it to us. But we do know that this is not Offenbach material, which is quite rare actually due to the complicated provenance of our collection. Part of the reason for this project initially was to try to examine more closely the individual provenances of the books. I think that's everything for me from this one. So I think I'm going to be passing it off to Eddie.
Wonderful. I guess we'll be answering questions at the very end. I think we decided, but your question's been acknowledged.
Can I answer a question that is?
Yeah, sure. What? Yeah.
So Judy wants to know why we're not wearing gloves while the rare book is being handled. And this is a great question, Judy. It's one we get, I think, every workshop. So in the past, that was considered best practice because the thought was that the oils from our hands would do significant damage to the books. In actual fact, as long as you're handling the book with clean hands, the oil on your fingers is not a major issue. You obviously don't eat a pizza and then flip the pages, but the idea is to use the tips of your fingers, and you're much more sensitive to the feedback from the book then. So one thing that they found was while wearing gloves, you're more likely to accidentally cause damage because you can't tell that something is going wrong until it's too late. So our fingers are more sensitive there than they are with gloves. I know that there are, I've read articles about museums that are like, we still have to handle it with gloves in front of people, even though we don't do that privately, because otherwise the only questions we get are related to why we're not wearing gloves, and people get quite upset. But actually it's an improved best practice.
Yep, thank you, Nicole. There's another question from Jenny Burns. Other than religious texts, sorry, that just flipped off my screen. Other than religious texts, were animal skins used for any book binding still in the 1400s, or had most of Europe switched to pulp? As far as I know, cotton rag paper was used for a very long time. I don't think wood pulp was used until, I don't know, Nicole, what, 17th century, perhaps even later than that?
The mid-1800s.
Mid-1800s, right. So it, in some cases, vellum was used, particularly for holy texts. But I think generally speaking, because there was always a pressure to keep costs down, they tried to streamline production as much as possible. So I'm not sure that there was necessarily a clear demarcation about whether animal skins were used simply for religious texts and cotton rag paper or other kinds of paper were used for secular texts. So I'm not exactly sure about that.
I think we can probably switch back to presenting and then pick up a
Actually,
couple more.
sorry, Nicole, can I just mention Mariana Greenblatt has had her hand up for a while. Not everybody has access to the chat. And Maxan also typed a question after that. Thank you. Mariana, did you want to unmute and ask your question? I just sent you an invite.
Would you like me to read the question, Lisa?
Maxan is somebody else.
Okay.
Mariana was raising her hand. So
Okay.
Mariana, are you able to unmute? Maybe while we're waiting, Eddie, did you want to read Maxan's question?
Sure. So what does illumination mean when referring to the books?
Can I just mention, I put my question in the chat for later, but I just wanted to get it written out. But we could do it later on.
Okay. That's fine. Nicole, do you want to answer the question about illumination?
I don't see a question about illumination, Eddie. It's possible it only went to you.
Okay. Yeah, I guess it was. Yeah, it was, what does illumination mean when referring to the books?
Oh, okay. Yes, of course. So illumination refers to illustration, essentially. So if you can picture those beautiful manuscripts with the funny drawings on the sides and in the at the bottom or wrapping around the page, the beautiful first big initials with images in them, that's illumination, essentially. Just a fancy word for picture books.
And I should point out that one of the characteristics of our rare book collection is that virtually none of them are illuminated. When you see beautiful illuminated books behind glass cases in museums, Book of Hours, things like that, we don't really have any of those in the collection. I mean, there are reasons for that, but most of our very expensive, and I think Hebrew Library and the Hebrew National Library got most of those during the redistribution after Offenbach happened. Shall we go on to the next text?
Yes.
Okay. A presentation like this wouldn't be complete if we didn't feature the earliest Yiddish book in the collection. We have about 9,500 Yiddish books in our entire collection. I'm not talking about the rare books collection. I'm talking about in the circulating collection, all of our special collections. 9,500 it's a big deal for a public library, and we are obviously the largest library with Yiddish books in Canada. Probably not North America. I'd say YIVO probably has more than we do, YIVO New York. But we include this because Yiddish has an esteemed status here at the Jewish Public Library. Now, very, very quick lesson in early modern Western civilization and history. There were three events that happened in the more or less 16th century that characterized the beginnings of the early medieval period. One was cartography, the Gerardus Mercator, the ability to actually take an image of the world and put it on a flat surface. There was the history of printing. There was development of printing by Johannes Gutenberg, which happened in the 1450s. And as I'm sure you recall from your history classes, in 1534, Martin Luther translated the Bible from, at the time, I guess it was Latin to German. Now, this caused a great stir in the German-speaking lands. Obviously, it was it heralded the beginnings of the Reformation. It started wars. It really kicked European history into high gear. And one of the things that I have discovered over the last few years about Luther, and one of the interesting things about Luther, I mean, we know some of the basics. We know he was an anti-Semite. We know that we know about his supposed nailing of 95 theses on the church door in Wittenberg, complaining about papal indulgences. One of the things you might not know about Martin Luther was that as a child, he and his parents moved across the various sort of provincial borders of Germany, and he developed an understanding of all of the German dialects that were spoken throughout all the German land. So he had an understanding of Low German, of High German. He could, in effect, speak whatever German dialect was used in whatever region of Germany that he was in at the time. And that was the main achievement of Luther's Bible. It was in German that all German-speaking peoples could understand, whereas before, German dialects were different enough that that would not have been possible before Luther. Now, that translation caused a great stir. This translation of the Bible into Yiddish caused no stir at all. This wasn't even a blip in history at all. But it does have a rather amusing story around it. Now, translations of the Bible have existed from the ancient period. There were there were Yiddish translations discovered in the Cairo Geniza, but the Bible had been translated into Greek, which was, as you know, was that the version of the Bible known as the Septuagint, or the Septuagint. The Bible was translated into Aramaic, the Targumim. It was translated into Judeo-Arabic by the Sadia Gaon in the 9th century. And there were other translations that emerged from Judeo-Spanish, Judeo-Italian, essentially Hebrew script used in the vernacular languages of where the Jews lived. This, however, was the earliest full edition of the Bible printed in Yiddish from 1678, 1679. The earliest printed Yiddish book that related to the Bible was actually printed about a century earlier, or about maybe 70 years earlier, called the Merkevet HaMishnah, the Second Chariot, which was a concordance. This particular book, however, was a classic example of a business failure. And that's one of the reasons that we actually tell this story. Uri Favish Halevi, who was born in 1625, was the Spanish and Portuguese synagogue's first rabbi. He was a member of Amsterdam's Bookseller Guild. He was a printer. In 1669, he printed the famous women's Bible, the Tzena Urena, which I'm sure many of you have heard of. At the time, what you should know about Amsterdam, that there was already an established Sephardic Jewish population that had escaped there from the Iberian Peninsula after the Inquisition. And the Sephardic population had enough time to establish themselves. They were quite prosperous. But in 1648, when the Khmelnytsky pogroms happened in the Ukraine, there was a massive immigration from Poland and from Eastern Europe to Amsterdam because the Netherlands was still considered to be a safe haven for Jews. It was a tolerant civilization. Now, Uri Favish Halevi, his Yiddish books were profitable in Poland. And what he decided was that what the world really needed was a Yiddish translation of the Bible. He was taking his cue from Luther's translation from 1534. He secured financing from a Christian backer. He obtained permission from the Council of the Four Lands, which was the rabbinic communal organization that granted licenses. He was provided with a translator and a proofreader, Yekutiel Blitz. The typesetter was a man named Joseph Witzenhausen, who was well known for his Yiddish translations of the Arthurian legends. And he was all set. He was on his way. But in the 1670s, Halevi suffered some financial setbacks, primarily caused by the Dutch wars that happened in 1672. And this stalled the printing of his Bible, and he lost his Christian underwriters. The war lasted 6 years. In 1678, he bounced back, and he found a brand new backer. This time, he had hired a Sephardic printer by the name of Joseph Athias as the new proofreader, and the future was shiny again, except it wasn't. Athias, who was an established translator in his own right, was not impressed with the original translation that was done by Yekutiel Blitz. And he gradually saw himself as quite proprietary over the original work, even though he had completed less than half of the proofreading. As the story goes, he absconded with 50,000 sheets of Blitz's translation, everything up to the book of Exodus, chapter 21, and then appealed to the Dutch authorities to print his own Yiddish Bible, using the 50,000 sheets as evidence of the advanced state of the work. And the Dutch authorities subsequently granted him a 15-year license to print the work. Now, what did he do? He hired a brand new proofreader, Joseph Witzenhausen, remember him, to complete the translation. Now, Halevi, Uri Favish Halevi, he contested the decision, tried to have it reversed. He failed, and then a race was underway to see who could print the first Yiddish Bible. And as it turns out, the Halevi Blitz team finished first in 1678, and Matthias's translation appeared a year later. The tragic comic part of this is that 6,000 copies were printed and they couldn't give them away. You couldn't sell them at auctions. Nobody was interested. And many of these were beautifully illustrated editions. I think you can see, I think on the title page, there is an example. We actually have, I think, this is partial. I think we have another one marked off where you can actually see an example of another section of the, which is more complete. And you can see they were quite beautiful. They were quite ornate. But because the Bible was rushed, because the illustrations were limited to just a few places, and needless to say, neither Matthias nor Blitz had access to adequate Yiddish dictionaries. So what they did was they incorporated a lot of Dutch words, they incorporated a lot of German words into the translation, and it was really a dog's breakfast of a translation. It was generally considered to be one of the poorest versions of the Tanakh that had been ever been printed. The book that we're showing here is, I don't believe this is the full 5 books. This is just a portion. But it was a colossal failure. But because it's the earliest Yiddish text in the Rebel collection, we include this just to give you an indication. Now, Yiddish works were not terribly popular. Hebrew books were far more lucrative, but again, people who were very poor could not afford to purchase very expensive Hebrew books. So the Yiddish book production was really not a thriving industry at this time. It took quite a while for Yiddish books to become printed in a more extensive and more ongoing way. At this point, I think we're going to move to the next book, which Nicole will share with you.
Thank you, Eddie. I'm just going to add like a little addendum to Eddie's comments about Yiddish printing, which is that at this point in time, there were no Yiddish printing houses. There were Yiddish printing arms of Hebrew printing houses, for example. Part of the reason for this, funny enough, is that most of the Yiddish readership at this point in time would have been either people with very little money or women. So women produced a great component of Yiddish readership. It's the reason for the Tzena Urena, which is completely unrelated. And I'm going to switch to talking about what I'm actually supposed to talk about, and not my particular interest in women in the history of Jewish printing. So this particular volume here is obviously not printed in Yiddish or in Hebrew. In fact, like the first book that we looked at, it's printed in Latin. This is the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus. For those of you who are extremely well-read, you probably already know what I'm going to talk about. But for those who don't, I'm going to draw your attention to a couple of different things. The title page in particular is extremely compelling in that there is no author indicated. The printer is listed as Henricum Kunrat, And the place of publication is indicated as being in Hamburg, which you can see down at the bottom beneath the little illustration there. What's interesting about this is that it's all a lie. This book was not printed in Hamburg. It was not printed by Henricum Kunrat, and there's a really good reason for why. So Henricum Kunrat did in fact publish a number of books. They were printed in all sorts of different places, including places that did not exist at all. Kunrat was the nom d'imprimeur, if you will, instead of a nom de plume, he wasn't writing, but rather printing under a assumed identity for a man named Jan Reeuwerts. Reeuwerts was a well-known Mennonite bookseller and printer in Amsterdam, where all of his books were printed, not in Hamburg, not in places that simply don't exist at all. However, he was known for printing particularly controversial texts. So Reeuwerts is his bookshop, in fact, was named in die Martelaars book, so in the Martyr's book, which goes to show a little bit, I think, of what he, how he thought of himself and those that he was printing on the sly. He printed works by Descartes, for example, and he also printed works by this author, not just this work, but others. This particular book was written, in fact, by Baruch Spinoza. He obviously, for those who don't know, Spinoza is an extremely controversial figure, which I have said about my previous author as well. Spinoza espoused that, so for context, Amsterdam was a fairly religiously free place. There's a reason that both the Sephardic Jews following the expulsion from the Iberian Peninsula established themselves there, followed shortly thereafter by Ashkenazi Jews who were fleeing from religious persecution in Poland and other places in Eastern Europe. Sorry, I just have a little frog in my throat. You were free to have a religion in Amsterdam. You were not really free to have no religion in Amsterdam, which was one of the arguments that Spinoza made. Spinoza, his father passed away when he was in his late teens, I believe, and he essentially passed off the family business almost immediately to his younger brother. He stopped paying synagogue dues. He was essentially cutting himself off or pushing away his community. This combined with the writings that he would later be known to have published, despite dissemblances like this, where there is no ownership of the work that clearly indicates it is Spinoza's. He essentially ends up getting in very hot water and is eventually, a herem is sort of called against him. This was fascinating to me as somebody who grew up Catholic, because Catholics love excommunication. We will excommunicate everyone. We will excommunicate ourselves, each other. We'll set up a pope to excommunicate the other pope. Like, if you are interested in Catholic religious history, it is full of excommunications. So reading more about Spinoza, it was quite compelling to understand just how rare and how significant this would have been. Which is part of the reason, of course, that he was trying to publish anonymously, because it was not just the Jewish community that was upset with him, but also the Dutch religious authorities in general. Him saying that freedom from religion, or freedom of religion, also means freedom from religion, was not a popular take. So despite the fact that his printer was Mennonite and likely a Rosicrucian, the it was not necessarily that Ria Wirtz agreed with Spinoza so much as that Spinoza represented a form of thought that Ria Wirtz was interested in. He actually ended up having gatherings banned from his bookstore. The authorities were following people to and from Ria Wirtz's bookstore, including Ria Wirtz himself. Although at some point he does eventually become the official printer for Amsterdam for a period of time. After he passes away, his son takes on the printing press and continues to print as both himself and as our friend Kunrat. What's particularly interesting about this volume, though, is that it has one of our only examples of errata in the back of the book. So the book is printed and then bound with printing errors so that the owner can go back through and correct the errors in the printing. Nowadays, we don't see that. There are simply errors and then they're corrected in future editions if they are corrected at all. But here, the owner has actually, you can see there are pencil marks where the owner has actually gone through and made the changes based on the errata in the printed work, which is extremely cool. I know he was not an atheist. I was not saying that Spinoza was an atheist. Sorry, I was saying that his work brushed very closely or fearfully for the authorities to the idea that would become atheism, essentially, which is that you are free not to be religious, or you should be free not to be religious. And I also know that excommunication from synagogue is very different from Catholic excommunication. I was just mentioning that it is a much bigger deal than Catholic excommunication in the broader sense, because Catholic excommunication historically tends to happen in ways that are obviously significant to the community, but tend not to be as individually significant. So this is a particularly compelling volume for a number of reasons. The fact that it is still in an excellent condition, that we have indication of use via the errata corrections, and also the incredibly dissembled title page, which represents one of our only examples of an attempt to completely obscure the authorship, printership, and location of printing due to the religious tensions surrounding some of what was happening between Spinoza and the Dutch religious authorities, and also the broader conversations surrounding free will, essentially. I think that's everything from me, and I will pass this back off to Eddie in keeping with time.
Yeah. Very good. We include this next book. We have a lot of fun in high schools when we bring our collection to high schools, because one of the things we do with this book is we make the students try and guess what language it's in. If we were there with you, we'd also ask to see if you could figure out what kind of paper it is. Since we can't do that, what I'd like you to do, just take a couple of seconds, if you have your chat open, I want you to see if you can take a guess what this language is. Just take a couple of minutes. If you want to just take a guess. We've got Amharic, Georgian, Coptic. Anybody else? If we had been Greek, if we had been organized, we would have put together a Zoom poll. We could have had you vote. Sanskrit. Anybody else? Nobody else. Okay. Well, ancient Greek. Okay. These are pretty good, and these actually mirror many of the responses that students give us, although there was one student who suggested Klingon was a possibility. We threw water on that particular one. Somebody says he sees Armenian, Slavic figures. Well, some of you are very close, particularly Rivka. Rivka, full disclosure, Rivka has been very active in the library for almost probably older than I actually am. But she's actually half wrong. She's half right and she's half wrong because the script is Amharic, but the language is not Amharic. The language is the Ethiopian liturgical language called Ge'ez. Now, Ge'ez, sometimes it's pronounced Ge'ez, is the liturgical language of the Ethiopian Coptic Church. But the Beta Israel community also used it in their own liturgy. This is probably the rarest work in the Rare Book collection. In all the years that I've been doing this, I have not really been able to get a handle on how many of these exist in the world. I know that there is a manuscript at the University of California. There are microfilms in Addis Ababa. There's a private collection in Florence. There's a partial copy at La Bibliothèque Nationale de France. But we've not really been able to get a sense of how many of these actually exist in the world. Now, this is a manuscript. This is a bound manuscript. It's not a printed work. Over the course of the beginnings when we were first running our Rare Book initiative, I sent a couple of pages to an Amharic speaker in Toronto, and he was able to confirm that the title of this work was The Liturgy of the Seventh Sabbath. Now, I'll talk a little bit more about the book in a second, but probably 30 years ago, there was a very entertaining book called The Ark of the Covenant, The True Story of the Greatest Relic of Antiquity. Now, according to Ethiopian tradition, the Ark of the Covenant is preserved in the ancient holy city of Aksum. And for centuries, the relic was kept in the Church of Mary of Zion, where the emperor was recorded as having seen it and spoken to it like an oracle in 1691. Now it's kept in a place called the Chapel of the Tablet, which was built beside the church during the reign of Haile Selassie. Now, the author of this book, and most of his research was disproven, it's guarded 24 hours a day, and the author never actually saw the relic, but he assumed that since this particular chapel was guarded 24 hours a day, de facto, the Ark of the Covenant was inside. Whether or not you believe this, there are a lot of origin stories about where the Beta Israel community, how they evolved, where they originated. The most common one was the story of the Queen of Sheba, who traveled to Jerusalem to question King Solomon, who arrived in a large caravan with precious stones, spices, and gold. There's a tradition favored by the Ethiopian Jews that a son, Menelik, was born to Solomon and Sheba, through whom all Ethiopian Jews descended. But there are other theories. There's a theory that Moses married an Ethiopian wife. There's a theory that Jews fled the Babylonian exile during the destruction of the first temple, and they would have traveled down to Egypt, down the Nile, settling in the hills of Gondar in northern Ethiopia, where they remained hidden for centuries. Another popular myth is that they are descendants of the lost tribe of Dan. This is in reference to a Jewish traveler and merchant in the 9th century who claimed to come from a Jewish state in East Africa. This traveler became known as Eldad Hadanit. One of the more commonly accepted theories, which has some basis in truth, is that they had their origins in the 4th century of the Common Era, where it was claimed that this community refused to convert to Christianity. And the Beta Israel community really come from that particular area of Gondar in northern Ethiopia. Now, this book, which is the Liturgy of the Seventh Sabbath, is a series of prayers. It's really a machzor. It's a machzor for Shabbos that is used by the Ethiopian Jews on the seventh Sabbath, and often on the 4th Sabbath of the 5th month. Now, the Sabbath is held in particularly high esteem by the Ethiopian Jews. Now, the Ethiopian Jews are similar. They've been compared to the Samaritans because there are many traditions and rituals that were unknown to them, quite distinct from rabbinical Judaism. But the Sabbath is pretty much the same. Friday afternoon, work stops, the women clean the hut, fires are put out, people only eat cold food, they dress in white clothes. Religious leaders called priests lead the prayers, and they read from their Bible, which is called the Orit. which is in the form of a book rather than a scroll. Now, this particular book, which is in Ge'ez, was printed on goatskin. You'll see there are some red letters sort of dotted throughout the pages. I don't know how well you can see them throughout the camera, but those red letters come from a practice called rubrification, and it's really meant to show emphasis in the text. I'm not a Ge'ez reader. I have actually never met any Ge'ez readers, but this book is particularly special also because of the way it's bound. If Ellen's just going to turn it around for you, and if you can see that the book is bound with twine, and this was known as Coptic binding or Coptic stitching, which comprises methods of bookbinding employed by early Christians in Egypt. The Coptic bindings are the first true codices. They're characterized by one or several sections of parchment or papyrus or paper sewn through their folds, and they're attached to each other with a chain stitch linking across the spine. And that became Coptic binding. This book was actually fully translated. It's available on the Internet Archive. If you actually Google Liturgy of the Seventh Sabbath, you'll get to the Internet Archive, and the entire work has been translated, if you're interested. And that's pretty much all I can tell you about this book. It's interesting as an artifact as much as it's interesting as a book. The final book in the workshop, we're at the hour mark right now. 2:30. Okay. This book has many layers that now most of you have heard of the Zohar. Most of you know what Kabbalah is, or at least have heard the word. The Zohar is the principal work of Kabbalah. And what is the Zohar? The Zohar is a mystical commentary on the 5 books of Moses. It's a mystical commentary on the Torah. Gershom Scholem, whose name might be known to some of you, who was one of the first well-known scholars of Kabbalah, referred to it as a mystical novel or a medieval fiction. Initially, the book was not called the Zohar. Zohar just means radiance or brilliance. The book was originally called the Midrash de Shimon Bar Yochai, the Midrash of Shimon Bar Yochai, who was a 2nd century sage. And the book really is a series, it's very difficult to describe, but it really recounts the adventures of a group of disciples and friends of Shimon Bar Yochai, their Chavraya, who wandered around the Galilee and encountered these very strange figures. An old donkey rider who, on the surface seems like a complete idiot, but is really in possession of great wisdom. A little annoying child who ends up knowing more than the rabbis do. The lesson being that you really never know who is going to be teaching you wisdom. Don't reject anybody. The style is it has a very loose narrative structure. It's a midrashic style, taking its cue from Peshat, which is one of the layers of interpretation of Torah. And all of this really was conducted to discover the deeper spiritual meanings of the Torah. The Zohar was really an examination of something called the 10 Sfirot. Sfirot was a sort of an obscure Hebrew word that meant numerical entities or numbers. But for the Kabbalists, Sfirot meant the aspects of God's personality. Reading Torah was understood as a secret code that would make available the inner dynamics of the divine personality, which utilized a really radical understanding of God as androgynous, as being both male and female. This is a very radical understanding of God at the time. But it also is one of the primary characteristics of the Zohar, the romance, often the erotic romance between the masculine and feminine aspects of God, the goal being to unite both aspects of God that can converge only through the human act, the mitzvah. Daniel Matt, who came out with a full translation of the Zohar, I believe in 2005 from Princeton University Press, describes the mitzvah as an aphrodisiac for the divine romance. God is incomplete without our active participation. The masculine aspect of God, Kadosh Baruch Hu, the feminine aspect, the Shekhinah, the union between these two aspects of God is the goal of the Kabbalist. And it is this convergence that the Zohar is concerned with. Now, the interesting part about the Zohar, of course, some of you might know that it is layered in mystery and legends behind its origins. Now, some believe that it was authored by Nachmanides, Moses ben Nachman. There are other theories that claim that manuscripts had been hidden in a vault for 1,000 years and had been discovered by an Arabian king who had sent them to Toledo in Spain to be deciphered. Some maintain that Spanish conquistadors had discovered the manuscripts of the Zohar, amongst many others, in an academy in Heidelberg in Germany. One of the most common ones that made the rounds of the Kabbalah underground was a story around from a man named Yitzchak of Akko. He was a disciple of Moses ben Nachman, and he traveled to Spain to meet somebody named Rabbi Moses de Leon. That's Moses de Leon was a rabbi in the north of Spain in Guadalajara who swore under oath that he was in possession of the manuscript written by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, and that the manuscript was in his hometown of Avila, and that he would gladly show it to Rabbi Yitzchak of Akko there. They met, they parted company. Rabbi Yitzchak proceeded to his home a couple of weeks later, only to be greeted by the widow of Rabbi Moses de Leon. Rabbi Moses de Leon had passed away a week earlier. And as the story goes, Yitzchak of Akko was acting on behalf of a wealthy merchant who wanted a copy of the Zohar for himself. And in exchange for that, he promised that his son, the merchant's son, would marry the daughter of Moses de Leon in exchange for the manuscript. So in other words, the Zohar, the manuscript, would become the dowry. When Moses de Leon's widow met him, he said, "I don't know what you're talking about. The manuscript to which you're referring was written by my husband. It was written by Moses de Leon." So this would have been around 1292, 1293. And why did Rabbi Moses de Leon try to pass it off as an ancient manuscript? Well, the answer is obvious. It would have fetched a much higher price. And obviously, passing something off as ancient wisdom is going to confer much greater status on the book. And for many years, it was thought that Shimon Bar Yochai was the author of the Zohar, but this has since been disproven. Daniel Matt, who I just mentioned, said it was actually the product of many hands. It was actually not just Moses de Leon. It was probably written by a number of authors, but that it was undoubtedly written in the 13th century. The Zohar is written in Aramaic, which was certainly not a spoken language in 13th century Spain. It also makes references to the Inquisition, something that certainly did not happen in the 2nd century of the Common Era. There are still debates in scholarly circles, but I'm going to leave that sort of the origin story of the work itself, but I'm going to leave it at this point, and Nicole is going to take over the story of this particular printing of the Zohar.
Thank you so much, Eddie. I feel like I learn something new every time you present on the Zohar, because you are constantly expanding what you have to say about it. So this particular copy of the Zohar was printed by the Shapiro family in I think this one's printed in 1815. And the story is incredibly compelling. The Shapira printing family, or the Shapira printing house, was founded by the Shapira printing family. They were given the first license in that area to print. They were part of a Hasidic community, and were large, constituted the employment for a large constituency of Slavuta, because their printing press was extremely well regarded, particularly for religious works, works on mysticism. They really set the standard for printing in that area for those types of books. So we actually have other copies of the Zohar printed by other printing families afterwards that really mimic the style of the Shapira Zohars. So as you can see, the title page is quite distinct in terms of its use of colors, the variation in font, or typeface rather. This book also is obviously well used and well loved. It is heavily inscribed on the paste down, and the binding has certainly seen better days. I'm particularly touched by the use of flannel on the spine, which is almost certainly not its original spine, but it is, I think, particularly charming in terms of what it demonstrates about the attachment that whomever owned it had to this text. The Shapiras were in a sort of not in a great place following the printing of this work. They had enjoyed the patronage of the last Polish prince or Grand Duke before the third partition of Poland, and it becoming essentially Russia. Slavuta is one of those unfortunate sort of border towns that was in many places, depending on the time in history. I think Eddie told me a joke once after I said that, where his grandmother was like, "Oh, where are we today? In the Ukraine or Russia?" And he tells the joke much better than I do. But that's kind of what Slavuta's geographic history is like. From day to day, it could be somewhere different. And unfortunately for the Shapiras, having enjoyed the patronage to such a degree really put a mark on their back when, after the third partition of Poland, the Russian Tsar was particularly anti-Semitic and also particularly keen not to have people who were still loyal to the previous Polish ruler have quite a lot of power, and the Slavutas did have quite a lot of power. They mostly managed to keep their noses clean, and it wasn't until a sort of large argument about the printing of the Talmud came up that the Russian authorities were able to sort of like see their chance and sort of really ruin things for the Shapira family. So the Shapiras had secured a right to print the entire run of the Talmud. And it's important to know that at this point in time, printing the Talmud was extremely time-consuming, extremely laborious, and also extremely lucrative. So generally speaking, printing licenses were granted to a printing press for a time period in which nobody else in the area could print the Talmud. Unfortunately for the Shapiras, sorry, I've made a minor error. They did not secure a license to print the Talmud. The Rom family had secured a license to print the Talmud. They printed their Talmud, and then the Shapiras printed their Talmud, and the Rom family was like, no, we have the license. And the Shapiras were like, well, ours is a Hasidic Talmud, so it's different. And the Roms were like, well, no, it's still the same Talmud. And that really put them in a bad spot because the Roms had the ear of the Russian authorities. And so now it was not just the Russian authorities in general keeping an eye on the Shapiras, it was quite a bit more intense. And unfortunately for the Shapiras, they employed a great number of people in Slavuta, which meant that they had great employees, but they also had, mediocre employees, probably what I would have been, and then some quite troubled employees. And one of their employees, not long thereafter, he was in sort of financial insolvency, his marriage was not great, and he ended up hanging himself in the local synagogue. This obviously caused a huge stir, but the Russian authorities saw it as their chance to finally deal with the Shapira problem. They arrested the Shapira father and 2 sons who were currently running the press and brought them to trial for the murder of their typesetter. They were tried and they were convicted of this murder. The burden of proof was not high, obviously, and the sentence was significant. They were sentenced to a severe beating and then an exile in Siberia. The story, according to a Yiddish literary journal that published it over 100 years later, called The Two Brothers of Slavuta, or The Brothers of Slavuta, is that the younger brother volunteered to go through the beating first in order to spare his older brother the brunt of the aggression. And that halfway through walking this gauntlet, his kippah falls from his head, and rather than continue and get it over with as quickly as possible, he bends to retrieve it and replace it before completing the gauntlet. The brothers do survive the beating and along with their father go to Moscow in order to pass a health check essentially before being exiled to Siberia. And the Jewish community there rallied around them. The brothers never passed their health check. They spent 20 years in Moscow being given food, being given parchment, and having the doctors consistently go, oh no, they're not healthy enough, before the death of the Tsar and his replacement. So his son was mildly less virulently anti-Semitic, and he was reviewing previous trials, basically, and the brothers were let go. They were allowed to return to Slavuta. In that time, they had completed a scroll, which is still with the, I think, a community in New York today. And then their families had continued to run the press in Slavuta. One of these descendants, by the late 1800s, the printing press had been sold off. However, they still owned a paper mill, and the family remained a very erudite, learned family who was very invested in books, in reading. And one of these families had sons, had daughters, and had one particularly bright daughter in particular. The sons were obviously raised with a traditional Jewish education, but what was unusual about their daughter was that she enjoyed a Talmudic education alongside her brothers. She was extremely well-read, she was extremely bright. Chava Shapira was a very ambitious young woman who unfortunately met mostly hardship and sort of stumbling blocks throughout her life in her desire to pursue this more enlightened life that she was interested in. She married quite young to the son of a wealthy Polish banker, thinking that it would get her out of backwater Slavuta, that she would get to see the world, and instead they settled in Warsaw, which was not quite the world that Chava was hoping to see. She had a son, but was quickly disillusioned with her marriage. And you can see her here with her first husband. She would frequently take large lengthy breaks from her husband, if you will, which would entail mostly going to the spa to take the waters with her mother and her son, whom she loved very, very dearly. And she, while there, met one of the friends of her parents. He was her parents' age, he was married, he had 4 children. He was considered a luminary, though, an intellectual luminary. He was a writer, he was a great thinker, and his name was Reuben Brainin, the founder of the Jewish Public Library. Chava was immediately taken with Brainin. They corresponded constantly. He was theoretically in love with her also, but presumably not to the extent that Chava was. She eventually writes to him saying she is going to leave her husband and abandon her beloved son in order to be with him. He attempts to dissuade her because he has no intention of doing the same, but she does, and is quite hurt when inevitably he does not leave his wife, does not abandon his children, and in fact moves to North America in order to be the editor of the Kenneter Adler, and subsequently found the Jewish Public Library. They do continue to correspond. At one point, he actually comes back to Europe and stays with her for 3 months, but nothing comes of it, obviously. Chava ends up getting, she goes to university. She I believe she gets a doctoral degree. She is consistently invited to come to Palestine. She made great connections in the salon of Eyal Peretz, and those people continued to write with her, converse with her. She became despite being writing frequently in Yiddish, taking on a pen name that I believe translates to Mother of All. She is also very interested in Hebrew, thanks to Brainin in particular, although her family had been invested in Hebrew as well. But she consistently rejects the opportunity to move to Palestine, in part because she does not want to be far away from her son, with whom she has reconnected. By this time, she has remarried. She's really settled in Prague. And unfortunately, that's where she remains in 1942 when she is incarcerated in Theresienstadt, where she passes away. And with her passing, sort of disappears her legacy. Much later in the later half of the 20th century, a librarian at the Jewish Public Library who was helping go through the archives discovered a bundle of letters wrapped in purple ribbon amongst the collections, the papers of Reuben Brainin, which had been donated to the library by his son following his passing and became the nuclear collection of the Jewish Public Library archives. And these letters, as they begin to go through them, are discovered to be Chava's half of a particularly ardent romantic correspondence. There are pictures, and which are what we have here, for example, and that's how their relationship was discovered. But in that correspondence was also revealed her writing ambitions. And so going through Yiddish periodicals from when she would have been publishing in order to find her writing, the story about her great-great-great-grandfather and uncle was discovered, and that was matched against Russian court cases and discovered to be true. And if you'd like to read more about it, there is a book called The Drama of Slavuta, which is an academic work on the conflict between the Rons and the Shapiras. And that is everything.
Hey, fabulous. On behalf of everybody here, I would like to really extend my heartfelt thank you. In Yiddish, we would say a herzlichen Dank to Eddie and to Nicole and to Azal, who is working the magnificent camera that has been spotlighting all of the books. So there are some questions that came in that were typed earlier in the chat. Just in the essence of time, I'd like to read those one at a time so that we can go quickly through them. So Richie asked earlier on, several old Sifrei Kodesh he's come across don't have a year of publication. Is that common, and why?
Sadly, yes. And I can't tell you how much longer it took us to catalog the rare book collection for precisely that reason. Sometimes there are clues based on some of the formats, some of the styles and way these books were printed. But in some cases, there's just nothing that you can do that will accurately date something. What you can do very often, we do have tools at our disposal. We have a 2-volume thesaurus of the Hebrew book, which actually cross-indexes titles, authors, places of publication. And sometimes you can actually narrow down when a book was printed based on this tool. It's a very complete tool. It was printed, I don't know, 30, 40 years ago. We use it quite often in order to sort of verify the date of a particular book, but it is very common.
Okay, excellent question. Thanks so much, Eddie, for the answer. Here's another one. This came in a while back from Allison. Thanks, Allison. Could Martin Luther speak, understand, or write in Yiddish?
I'd like to imagine that he could, although I think it's highly unlikely. Yiddish was derived from High German, but written in Hebrew characters. And where it was likely Martin Luther read Hebrew, it's quite unlikely that he spoke Yiddish or would have had occasion to speak Yiddish at all. And I mean, I certainly something I could look into, but I would be very surprised.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Richie had another question. Does your collection have any of the original printing blocks for the Hebrew and Yiddish? And if not, do those exist at other museums?
We don't. I've never seen any. I have seen a few printing blocks in our archives, but I think they were mainly used for aesthetic reasons. I don't think they were certainly not used to print books. We're not a museum, obviously. We're an archives and we're a library. But no, we don't have any of the original Hebrew or Yiddish printing blocks. A lot of those linotype, those factories, the Eagle, a lot of the printing factories here, we don't know actually what happened to their equipment when they closed up. We still have connections to the Volosky family. I'd probably ask them, but I doubt it.
Okay, amazing. In the essence of time, what I'm going to do is I'm going to officially wrap up and do my closing remarks. There have been some other fabulous comments and observations and sharings that have been posted in the chat. So what I would say is after I finish, then we can stay on a little longer and have a bit more of, an informal chit chat for a few moments. Okay. So I really, again, just want to thank everybody who has brought us this wonderful treasure trove of the books. For myself, when Eddie, when we first met and you described that, you normally do these workshops in person and it's not the same with the tactile and the smell, but I have to tell you that just being in the presence of these tomes and seeing them up close with that magnificent camera that you had, all the detail work, your presentation so beautifully crafted and lovingly put together. So this really has been an extremely special program. I'm so grateful to Eddie Paul, Nicole Beaudry, and Iselle Carter, and the special collections staff of the Jewish Public Library in Montreal for sharing this fascinating and very special program and initiative with our community. If you are not familiar with Montreal's Jewish Public Library, I strongly encourage you, please take a moment after, visit their website. They offer wonderful virtual programs and resources. Please join me in a well-deserved round of applause for Eddie, Nicole, and Iselle, and the special collections staff. We're so grateful.
Thank you. Just a couple of things before people leave. I also wanted to thank.
Eddie, sorry, just one sec. I just wanted to make my closing announcements and then
I'm
I'll.
sorry.
That's okay. No problem. No problem. So just because I know the folks who are in this room who are gathered, I have a feeling that two of the programs that our JCC is hosting for free this month, I think that they might be of interest to you. So Yiddish Voices of Kensington Part 2, The Everyday Lives of Early Jewish Immigrants. We are hosting this virtual lecture the afternoon of Thursday, February the 16th. Respected Yiddish translator Vivian Felsen is going to be highlighting the occupations and preoccupations of Toronto's early Yiddish-speaking immigrants between 1900 to 1920, including how they found employment, started businesses, courtship, marriage, fraternal organizations, benevolent societies. If you can't join us live on Zoom, this lecture will be recorded. And also, Richard Ovenden, Libraries as Defenders of Open Society. This is a special in-person program at the Toronto Public Library that will be held the evening of Thursday, February the 23rd. Richard Ovenden is director of the famed libraries at Oxford University, and he authored the book The Burning the Books, A History of the Deliberate Destruction of Knowledge. So he will be discussing the central role that local libraries play in ensuring that knowledge and history are preserved, and how political, religious, and cultural motivations can drive censorship, book banning, and other threats to our open and civic society. This presentation is being presented by the Toronto Public Library in partnership with our JCC, and the recording will be available via YouTube. So for more information about any of these or other adult daytime events at the Miles Nadell JCC, please email me, Lisa R. There's a bit of an echo, at mnjcc.org. So I'm going to officially sign off and turn it back to Eddie and Nicole. It was wonderful connecting with all of you today. I wish everybody good health, all the best for 2023, and I hope to see many of you very soon at the virtual Miles Nadell JCC.
Thanks, Lisa. I just wanted to, you had forgotten, Ellen Belshaw, the Education Outreach Librarian, has also been instrumental in this initiative, and we just forgotten to acknowledge her. So I just wanted to include her name as well. I also wanted to, if anybody is interested in future workshops, these are a regular part of our outreach initiative. And just to keep a watch on our website, our next one will be in March with the University of Pennsylvania, and March 16th with the University of Pennsylvania on provenance. They've actually done some remarkable work on tracing entire collections of Judaica that were stolen by the Nazis. So that's going to be quite a special program for us. Thank you.
Okay, fantastic. And I also just wanted to thank my colleague at the JCC, Anne McElraith, who was very, very busy behind the scenes, letting everyone in and spotlighting and chatting. So well done, Anne. Thank you so much. So I really do encourage people at this point, like I know Mariana, you had your hand up earlier. Maxanne, you had a question that was more specific to Toronto Jewish Library. So this is an opportunity. We'll stay on a few more moments if that's okay, if Eddie and Paul and Nicole can spare the time just for a few more minutes. So if you do have a question and you don't have the ability to chat, please. Maxanne, did you want to unmute? Here, can you do it?
Well, this is just, I wanted to take this opportunity to raise an issue that I have tried desperately to raise in Toronto. There is no Jewish public library. There's a Holocaust library. The collection of books is sitting rotting somewhere. The Aesthetics Library is a junk room. The Cecil Roth collection, I don't know where it is. And I wonder why there is no will in a city with the largest Jewish community in the country to have a library. Every time I hear about the library in Montreal, I'm just filled with so much envy. And I thank you so much for telling us more about it.
Well, thank you. I was in touch with people from the Lantner Library just 2 years before they closed, and they were consulting with us. And it just seemed like the community didn't want to support a library in which you already had 100 branches of the Toronto Public Library that served. And I know they're not, you have the Barbara Frum Library, which has a kind of Judaica collection, but nothing like us. We're an old community. We're an older community than Toronto, and certainly a smaller community in Toronto. But that means obviously it's not a question I can answer very easily. Hey, look, we're always under threat with diminished budgets. The city of Montreal has 70,000 Jews left, and philanthropic patterns have changed dramatically. So it's actually a constant effort for us to survive. But we're fighting. We're trying to make ourselves relevant, and this is one of the ways in which we make ourselves relevant. But thank you very much.
Okay, that was a great question, Maxine. Sarah Lee from Nova Scotia, you had your hand up, and then Rivka.
I have lots to say. First, I wanted to ask Eddie about the 4 portraits behind you. I can't figure out who they are, and if you could tell us. Also, about a number of people have talked about the linotype and Yiddish linotype history. You probably know that the Yiddish Book Center in Amherst is launching a major exhibit. It will be run in October, and they will be including pictures of the presses at the Canada Redler.
Yes, I did that. Yes.
Yeah, of course. And I in 1958, when I was 21, I was managing editor of the Canadian Jewish Chronicle, which used the same presses as the Canada Redler. And I don't know if many people know, many of the linotype operators were French Canadian, as we called them then. Right. And Mr. Trossman was the foreman, but the linotype operators didn't speak English, but some of them could read Yiddish. It was an amazing place to work.
Yeah, that's right.
Who are the portraits behind you?
I'm helped by the nameplates also. Ruben Bryanen is that black and white sketch.
Right.
This is Rachel Korn, the
Oh,
poet.
right.
This is Paul Troutman, one of our former directors.
Yes.
And just to the right is Leah Robeck, the radical, the feminist. We have her archives. We actually did an event around a biographical novel based on the life of Leah Robeck, including work from our archives last year. So yeah.
Thank you very much.
You're
I'm visiting today. Thank you.
I'm so glad you did, Sarah Lee. Thank you so much. Rivka, go ahead, and then after that, Jerry.
Well, before I say what I was going to say, just to add to, Eddie is actually sitting in a room where around him are pictures of many Yiddish writers and Yiddish personalities. We could do a whole workshop just talking about all of these people. Really, I truly do a workshop. But to Maxine, it would be great to get a little message from you, because there are people who think because there is, there aren't other Jewish libraries, that this is a reason for this one not to be important, when in fact, of course, we believe it's the opposite, that our Jewish public library is something to treasure and to support. But there is, by the way, there's a community library, a Jewish community library in San Francisco that I discovered during COVID. And every time I get a message from them, it feels like they're, not like the Jewish Public Library, but similar in the kind of programming they do and then the kind of books that they put forward. And lastly, thank you. It's really interesting, even though I've been involved in the library for so many years, to hear it presented to people who might not be so familiar. It puts things in a certain kind of perspective. So I do thank the staff, because I always learn something, even though I think I know most of what's going on in the library.
I'll just take a moment to plug the Vancouver Jewish Public Library, the Isaac Waldman Library, because that's where I am. It's small but mighty. So if you're in Vancouver, there's a small Jewish public library here as well.
Amazing. Thank you very much. Okay, I think the last question of the day, I always say all good things must come to an end. Jerry, would you like to unmute?
Hi. My father's cousin, who's also my cousin, Sam Friedman, he was the first linotype operator, Jewish linotype operator in Canada. In Montreal, he worked for the Canada Redler, and my dad used to go visit him up there back in the 1930s. And from what Sarah Lee was saying, that there was going to be a presentation about that. I'd be really interested in finding out more because I have a picture of Sam. He was originally from Brest-Litovsk, what's now Belarus, and he had come to New York. And in 1917, he immigrated to Montreal, and he eventually became a citizen in 1923. And he died in Montreal, and he's buried there. And my dad said they went to the paper. He got to see the linotype machines and everything. And that's when he was a little boy back in the 30s. So that was just to hear about this was interesting. And thank you for such a wonderful presentation, to see the books. And it's just fantastic. So thank you for this program too.
Thank you so much for that. We love those positive comments. I do encourage folks, before you leave, if you can, type them in the chat. My colleague Anne posted my email address, lisa.r@mnjcc.org. We love receiving post-event comments, which of course we will share with Eddie and Nicole and their team. And I just wanted to mention one other thing, before we officially go, if I may, because I would be remiss if I didn't mention this. So Rivka Augenfeld, of course, is here with us today. And on a personal note, I just want to mention that there was an extra special reason that I wanted to host today's program, apart from the fact, of course, that this is magnificent history that we wanted to share with our Toronto community. My late Bubby, a Holocaust survivor who was originally from Vilna, was dear friends with Liba and David Augenfeld. Those of you in Montreal will surely recognize those names. David and Libby, as I grew up knowing them, were also Holocaust survivors and partisana. They fought in the resistance during the war. They immigrated to Montreal in 1948 and dedicated their lives to preserving secular Yiddish culture, including being involved in every Yiddish program undertaken by the JPL for decades. And their daughter, Rivka Augenfeld, who is an honorary board member of the JPL, amongst her many, many other talents, is another dear family friend. And so it was extra special for me to be involved with today's program. And Rivka, I am sending you love from Toronto to Montreal. And that's it.
Thanks, Lisa.
Okay.
The only thing I'd like to add, Lisa, is that we would be really happy if we could send all of the attendees a feedback form. So if we could, maybe you could redistribute it. We'd be happy to do it as well if you want to share the email addresses, but we'd just be just as happy to send it to you, just to send, because the feedback is important to us.
Absolutely. We love feedback. And so what will happen is probably late tomorrow, or if not, then Monday, Anne is going to be sending everybody who attended, plus people who registered and couldn't attend live, the recording of today's lecture. Eddie, you were kind enough to also send us in advance a list of some resources.
Right.
And so Anne will be including those as well for those of you who would like to continue to, expand your knowledge. So when we do that, Eddie, just send it to me and we'll make sure that we include that with that email. Sound good?
Sounds good.
Great. Guess what, my friends? That's it for today. So again, on behalf of the Miles Nadel JCC, thank you so much to everybody for joining us today. Across Canada, across the US, some of you who joined us from Europe and in England, what a treat. So I wish everybody again good health. And could the team from the JPL just stay on one moment, and Rivka?
Okay.
Thank you. Okay, be well,
Bye.
everybody. Take
Bye.
care. Well,
Bye-bye.
bye. Have a great afternoon. Good health.
Thanks, Lisa.
And thank